Good morning to those in the US, North America. Good afternoon if anyone is signing in, tuning in from the UK, and good evening to those of you joining in from India or thereabouts. Hi, my name is Ashok, and some of you know me because of my courses. Others know me because of my years of work in conflict resolution, peace building, and more recently on matters related to democracy. So, just to be very clear, I have never done live streaming before. And it should be easy, but it isn't as uh, intuitive for me, primarily because I'm the kind of person who is a face to face, in person kind of guy. I communicate best when I'm ideally sitting across a table with friends or clients. I've gotten used to working on Zoom. So, as some other folks who are here right now, they know me from my courses and my discussion groups that happen on Zoom. But I have often struggled if I have to speak to a camera without another human being looking across at me. So this is a new thing. So forgive me if sometimes I stumble and I am grasping for words because it's not so much the words that are hard to come by. It's more the fact that when I look into the camera, I'm seeing my own funny mug. I'm not seeing you. But anyway, that's all the clarification. That's all the apologizing. Let me give you a short introduction on why I'm doing this in the first place. The way I see it, most of my work, particularly in the last 10 years, has been related to education. I teach courses, and these are very long courses, 12 sessions long, on matters related to democracy, pluralism, critical thinking. I also post a lot of content on social media, and I have of late started a Substack channel for my essays, and very recently, the YouTube channel for my videos. And at the same time, I feel things are happening so quickly. Almost every day, the world is changing even as I speak. The last greatest upheaval uh, was the White House meeting with Zelensky, Trump, and Vance. Nothing like that has happened in my living memory in public. I'm quite certain that these conversations are not um, unusual behind closed doors. But for the whole world to see, to have presidents squabbling and one president and vice president talking down and berating the president of another country. This is totally unprecedented for me. The live stream, this Sunday morning live stream, is an attempt to touch upon the most significant things that are happening in our world and to comment about it and to get into some kind of a conversation with you, not in terms of what happened and whether we like it or not. Because I'm at a stage in my life where I realize that most of what I want isn't possible. I know that sounds negative, but think about it. Whether it's in terms of the economy, whether it's in terms of politics and democracy, whether it's in terms of the nature of human relationships, particularly after the smartphone and the internet, the world seems to be moving in a way that is very, very different from the way you and I might have preferred it to be. So, what is the purpose of these live stream sessions? It is to try and take a step back from the most significant and loudest things that are happening, and to ask ourselves if we are missing anything beyond the noise, beyond the heat, beyond the anger and the emotions that are coming. What else is happening? And so each Sunday morning, for me, I will select a theme, and I would very much welcome you folks sending me topics that you would like to discuss, and I will open up the conversation. And I'm hoping, despite the fact that it's you are restricted to text messages or comments, I'm hoping that we can have as much of a back and forth as possible. So, to begin with, I would like to invite you to just write down whatever comes to your mind when you hear the term agreement. Agreement. Okay, whatever comes to mind. I see Rukmini, I see Pilar, I see Masroor. Great to see you folks. So, what comes to your mind when the theme or the word agreement comes to you instinctively? Don't think too hard. Just give me a couple of words that I can work off. The reason why I chose this topic is, and I'll share that with you in a bit. Pilar says, rather not Pilar, Rukmini says, it's a pleasant state of being, though it can be boring if it's there all the time. Wonderful. What a great way of starting. Agreement creates a fuzzy feeling. And why does it create a fuzzy feeling? Because in our interaction with someone, we are constantly on the watch out, on the lookout for whether we have compatibility. Are we okay now? And this happens even on the street. You walk on the sidewalk, you cross another person, the immediate subconscious thought that comes to mind is this person going to smile? Is this person going to walk past me? Or worse, is this person in some way going to make me feel awkward or uncomfortable or even threatened? It's normal. We might not consciously think this. So when we encounter people, we immediately try to figure out whether this person is a friend or a foe, whether this person is a completely irrelevant factor in my life, or whether there's the possibility of some kind of engagement. Masroor says agreement is fundamental to all relationships. This is something that we all know. When we think in terms, and it starts with a binary. As human beings, and we know from psychology, as human beings, we tend to be looking at everything and everyone in terms of whether it's good for us or bad for us. So, for instance, even something as simple as the weather, people look at the weather in terms of whether it works for them. Is it a lovely sunny day? Is it going to rain? Is it going to be too cold or too hot? And we look at people the same way. Is this a good person or is this a bad person? Is this person my friend or my enemy? Is this person going to help me or is this person going to stand in my way? Pilar says commitment. Agreeing is the first step towards creating any kind of commitment. Because obviously, what happened between Zelensky and Trump and Vance is that there was no commitment either on material trade or on security guarantees because there was no agreement. Agreement is the basis for anything else. So let's take a closer look at agreement. If agreement is the basis for us to continue a relationship, what do we do when that agreement is in question? I'll give you an example. And the reason I give this example is because it happened just a couple of days ago on social media. Now, I'm not very comfortable with social media, as I'm not comfortable with this format itself. I'm guessing over a few sessions, I'll become more comfortable talking to the camera and not seeing your wonderful faces. But I noticed on social media that even people who agree with me on some things, if I say the slightest thing that veers off from their idea about the topic, they immediately see it as disagreement and as a problem. In other words, I can agree with someone 95% of the time, but if I disagree with someone for that 5% or they disagree with me, it's almost seen as a breach of the relationship. It's almost as though they look at me and say, how could I have agreed with this person for 95% of the time? Because here, this person doesn't agree with me. That means I am mistaken about this person. I'm just curious. Feel free to write down if you have had this kind of an experience or if your experience is different. Masood says depends on what that 5% is. And that's a very interesting statement. You see, here's the thing. I disagree with my wife on maybe 60%, not 5%. But we're together because those 60%, the 65% that we don't agree, are not as significant as the 35 to 40% of the things that we agree upon. So, quantifying this in a manner of speaking is important. But let's come back. Why is disagreement so upsetting, even disagreeing? Sorry, why is it disagreeable? What happens to us when someone disagrees with us? Anyone? When was the last time someone disagreed with you, and how did you respond to it? Were you surprised that they disagreed? Did you get a little irritated? Were you upset? So Masroor says, we don't trust, when someone disagrees with us, we don't trust them as much. And we don't feel like trusting either. Here we have Rukmini saying, if there is an agreement on what one can disagree on, it makes a relationship easier. I suppose. Else, disagreement feels like an experience of denying my identity or security. That's very interesting. That disagreement can make it feel like I am no longer legitimate or valid. My identity is suddenly in question. That's interesting. And we have Angela who says a compromise can be an agreement. Of course, a compromise is an agreement. We agree to come somewhere in the middle. It just is a decision to move in the same way forward. Okay? A compromise is a way to move in the same way forward. Absolutely, Angela. Justice is when the path forward and the emotions behind the agreement are equal. Okay, okay. We can sit with that for a moment there. Let's come back to Rukmini's point about disagreement, challenging our sense of self, our identity. Why does this happen? Why is it so important? Why is it important that you agree with me and that validates me? What happens to me when you agree with me? Pilar adds to our conversation saying that this is the reason why she doesn't engage with people on social media, because meaningful engagement is very difficult or impossible. Absolutely true. Absolutely. So, my question is, what's the relationship between agreeing or disagreeing and your identity, your sense of self? I mean, let's take something very simple. I walk into a room and I say, my God, it's hot. And you're sitting there and you say, no, it's not hot. I'm feeling cold. So we disagree. Is it just a question of our disagreeing and then we leave it like that? Or what else happens? What else happens when I think the room is hot and you think the room is cold? Where do we go from there? I don't mean in terms of negotiation, in terms of feelings. What happens to you when the other person says that the temperature doesn't work for them? Peter joins us and he says his sense of self feels threatened. He feels threatened. So let's take this little example of the temperature, the temperature of the room. You think it's too hot, the other person thinks it's cool. How does this affect both of them, you and the other person? What happens once you realize that there's a difference in terms of optimal temperature? So Masroor says it depends on the power equation. Okay, so Masroor, can you flesh that out? Let's just say you're the person with less power. How does this affect how you feel and how do you react? Something as simple as the temperature in the room happens to me pretty much every all the time, because I'm the kind of person who prefers to keep the temperature low. I like a cooler room. Rukmini says a lot of relationships are based on the needs of a certain identity. If that is denied or attacked, the relationship comes into question. Very interesting. And can you give an example, Rukmini, or anyone else, of the of a certain identity that feels attacked or denied when there's disagreement? And Peter adds to that, the conversation turns into how our relationship is being threatened rather than that we are struggling over how to define and resolve the problem. Absolutely. Anyone who is familiar with psychology or conflict resolution or mediation, we know this, that it's very easy for the problem that we are dealing with to get subsumed by the identity or the relationship issues that show up. In other words, it's no longer about the temperature. It's about, are you offending me? It's about, are you diminishing me? Uh, Pilar, what do you mean by dopamine hit here? Which is the dopamine trigger? And Masroor, going back to his point, says, at a weaker position, I will start thinking of building a compromise agreement. Very interesting. When there's a disagreement, it's so much easier if I don't have power for me to move towards seeking an agreement or a compromise. When I feel I have power, what happens? So Masroor and the others, Masroor gave a great example of a person with less power wanting to. But what happens when you have more power? You walk into the room and you set the temperature wherever you want, and the others are feeling extremely cold, and you have power. You know there's disagreement. How are you affected by it? Now you have power. Rukmini says, I might find it difficult to be close friends with someone with a radically different worldview. So if there's a relationship and the person suddenly shifts their stance, it could be scary. This is very interesting. There are so many things that come into play here. A relationship is very often built on a series of agreements. So, my wife and me, there are many major agreements to live together, to take care of each other, to um, to respect each other's space, to help out in the household chores, which I know I can do much better. There are many big agreements and there are many small agreements. So, one of the small agreements that I have had to consciously adhere to is not leave things in the wrong place. See, I grew up with things all over the place. The house was clean, but not neat. Now, my wife grew up in a home where everything was in the right place. It took me years, I'm ashamed to say, to come to an agreement where I would respect her need to keep things in the right way, in the right place. So that's a smaller agreement. But there are many other agreements we've realized over years. We don't need to have an agreement on these things. Politics is one thing, or even our intellectual, the ways in which we look at the world. It's different. And in the beginning, in the first few years, those disagreements about looking at the world, our analysis of how the world works, those became huge issues until we realized at some point that, you know what, the really important thing in our marriage is our ability to care and love and take care of each other. So I see a lot of comments. This is great. Uh, so, as Peter said, the conversation becomes about the relationship being threatened rather than the problem at hand. And uh, that Peter suggests then, my identity is about me as a helpful, as contributing towards making things easier for us and others, my usefulness in the world. With power, I have to find a way not to misuse it. If I can take advantage of someone, I have an extra burden of questioning how to both express respect and influence the outcome as I would like. So here we have a situation where someone with power in a relationship is particularly conscious about how to use that power so that the other person is not adversely affected. I mean, this is exceptionally mature. Most of us, when we have power, we are not even conscious of it. Um, or we're conscious of it and we work to maximize its effect on the other person. So, what Peter is talking about here is a very mature, wise way of exercising his power. Masroor says, at a stronger position, I'll set it at a cooler temperature and put some blankets out. I love it. So, Masroor is doing two things here. He is not choosing to agree or come to an agreement about the temperature, but he has power. Now, remember what Masroor said earlier, which is very important, that if he didn't have power, he would try to come into a compromising situation. He would try to come to an agreement or compromise to come to an agreement. But when he has power, he does something very interesting. He sets it at the temperature that's comfortable for him. And then he puts out blankets for the other person. This is, thank you for saying that, Masroor, because this is very different, but at the same time, at one level, not so different from Peter's approach. It's similar in that with power, you are also exercising compassion, but you're being very clear about not compromising. That's interesting. And you are setting the temperature at your comfort level. And I have to say, particularly when I was running my organization in India, Metaculture, and we had this thing all the time, even in winter, and Bangalore winters were mild, but even so, most people would be wearing sweaters, and I would be sitting in my half sleeves with the fan on. And it almost became the norm that people would bring sweaters to the office in winter, even in summer, because I would sit with the fan right on top of me or the air conditioning, and I would have people bring their sweaters or shawls. So we use, but it's interesting when I look back at it, I didn't try to come to an agreement, mainly because it was my office, I had the power, and I felt I needed to be comfortable. So I didn't, I was not acting at the most compassionate or generous level. I did warn people that they should bring in sweaters or warm clothes or whatever. Oh, so Pilar says when someone agrees with her, she gets a dopamine hit. That's that's very interesting. Let's just for a moment, we've touched on a lot of things. Let's focus on what Pilar said. What are the ways in which you feel so good? Or rather, why do you feel so good when someone agrees with you? Pilar says a dopamine hit. Something goes off in her head, and there's an enormous sense of warmth and a good feeling. What else happens? I'll focus this question a little. After an argument, the other person agrees with you. What happens to you? You have a debate, you have an argument, you have a conversation. It doesn't have to be heated. You start off at different places, and then you remain here, they agree, come closer and agree with you. What happens to you then? What happens when they come to your way of thinking? It validates me. If I'm in need of more self-esteem, I get a boost. Excellent. And I'm guessing we will all agree with this. So I have a I have a different question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you have not been validated by an agreement? Have you ever been in a situation where an agreement made you feel uncomfortable? Peter also says the same thing. When people agree with him, he feels validated, recognized, increases his perception that I have power and that my way will save the day for the world. Masroor says, I actually feel a little bad because I think I have negotiated too hard. Again, I mean, I'm not trying to categorize you in any way, Masroor, but I would say um, that comes from a certain sense of power, that being conscious of your power, you wonder if you have pushed too hard. That's a very interesting one. Is there any other reason why you may feel not entirely happy when someone agrees with you? Why else would you feel something's missing if someone agrees with you? Rukmini says, in situations where I'm hoping for a different perspective and I'm not challenged, it can be disappointing, especially if my point of view is bleak and I was looking for hope. So I'm guessing, Rukmini, you feel that a lot with me. You come to me looking for hope and I add to your bleakness. But that's interesting. You're looking for something else, particularly if your take on the situation is not complete in itself, because you feel, because part of the engagement, the relationship, the conversation is because you genuinely want something different from the other person. That's great. Any other reason, any other reasons for not being thrilled when you feel, when you hear an agreement? Okay, Peter says again, if the agreement is reached through acquiescence or capitulation, it can be a Pyrrhic victory. Okay, so in other words, if so, I'm just putting my own words here, Peter. But if you think the other person is feeling bullied, then the agreement isn't particularly useful for you, right? Uh, Masu says depends on what discussion led to the agreement. If the agreement meant a huge power play, then I might not have a good feeling, even if I'm happy to have an agreement in my choice. So that's an interesting distinction between agreement gets you what you want. I get the temperature exactly at my level, but the other person is feeling crushed or defeated. And then I feel, oh my God, this has affected the relationship. I've ruined this person's mood, even if I have gotten what I wanted. That's, again, what Masroor is doing here, and what Peter is also talking about, is they are talking of having a greater sensitivity to the other person's state of mind. And they are worried that they might have adversely affected them, forcing them to acquiesce. Rukmini says, there's no learning in agreement for the most part. I don't enjoy agreements in learning spaces sometimes. Thank you. This is what I was reaching for. In my courses, very often, not all the time, very often, there are people who will say, oh, I totally agree. And that kills the conversation. An agreement often destroys the possibility of exploration. And in most conversations, most human engagements can be seen as learning conversations. And the problem with a lot of conversations today, particularly on social media, but even amongst friends and allies and peers, is people are so desperately searching for agreement. If you agree, I will. If you agree with me, I will. Um, I will tell you how wonderful you are. I will tell you how much I agree with you, and I'll give you 5 more reasons for you to agree with me. So it's a back and forth of mutual acknowledgement and validation. And the tragedy is that most people today are happy with that kind of engagement. In other words, even the slightest disagreement that can potentially open up the conversation for exploration, for discovery, for reflection, is seen as a threat to the identity. This is a very unfortunate state of affairs. Let me give you an example that I've used very often, particularly when I talk about relationships. My favorite contemporary Chinese philosopher, Lin Yutang. I say contemporary because he died in the early 60s, but he was a 20th century philosopher. He once talked of the difference between Eastern relationships. He was talking of Chinese, of course, ancient Chinese, not communist China, okay? Uh, Chinese relationships and Western American relationships. He says, in a Chinese relationship, the man and the woman are, are figurines, made of soft clay. So they come together at a very early age, maybe in their late teens or early 20s, and they are still soft, the clay is still soft and malleable. So they come together and there's a dance that takes place. And that dance forms their shapes and they blend into each other and create a couple. And all the soft edges or the hard edges are smoothed over and they become soft. And that's the idea of the Eastern relationship. The Western American relationship is a well defined man and a well defined woman, maybe in their late 20s, 30s, very clear about who they are, professionally accomplished, probably financially secure, independent. They come together and they try to have that dance because all relationship is a dance. And when they try to have that dance and their clay is hardened and brittle, they crack. They don't meld like the Eastern. They crack because every part is encrusted, hard, and it breaks apart. What we are seeing, the reason Pilar and many others don't wish to engage on social media is this. Each one of us comes as a fully formed human being with very clear ideas. In other words, when I comment on Trump or on Putin, I'm very clear about my stance. I come there and I tell the world what my stance is. You either agree with me completely or you are affecting my fully formed sense of who I am. And that means I could break. This is the reason why disagreement threatens us so much, because we are not soft clay anymore. We have so many opinions on everything. We don't walk into any situation saying, I don't know. We don't walk into a situation saying, you know what, I'm a little confused about what happened in the White House with Zelensky. Tell me more. How did you see it? I come in with a very clear idea. This happened. This was morally X or Y. And what should have happened is 1, 2, 3, and it didn't happen. So suddenly we live in a world where everything is binary. Everything is based on agreement or disagreement. There's no opportunity, there's no need for learning at all. Why should I learn if I know everything? I'll give you an example. I was in a meeting, and at one point I asked, "What do you hope to learn from this meeting?" And without exception, people said, "I want to learn how we can come to a conclusion that works for me." In other words, all I'm interested in learning is whether and how you will agree with me, because there's curiosity there. What strategy should I use? Should I communicate differently? Should I message differently so that you will agree with me? Uh, One of the interesting things that I picked up after Kamala Harris's loss in the presidential elections was there was very little real reflection or rethinking taking place in the Democratic Party. Many people were focusing on the messaging. Oh gosh, our messaging didn't work for the working class, for white men, for Hispanic or African Americans who voted for Trump. We need to change our messaging. We need to change our branding. In other words, my message is okay. My content is okay. My views are okay. My policies are okay. My values are okay. The only question is, how do I present it so that you can accept and agree with me? Let uh, It's 10:41. I don't want to keep you folks for too long, but this has been an interesting experiment. I just want to touch on uh, a couple of the questions and comments that have come up. Peter says, depending upon how the agreement, yes, we've touched on that. Um, Okay. Rukmini says there's no learning in agreement. Absolutely. For the most part, I don't enjoy agreements in learning spaces sometimes. And Masood says, agreed. Culturally, most agreements come from people in power or by appealing to a higher authority. Absolutely. In fact, we've what started off as a conversation on agreement has opened up. And this is, in a way, what I want our Sunday morning sessions to be, or Sunday evening sessions to be. I want us to see the interconnections. What started off as agreement, talking about agreement and disagreement, went into issues of identity, went into issues related to how it, emotions and how it makes us feel. Then it went into relationships, and then it went into power, and then it went into the idea of learning and exploration. Something as simple as agreement or disagreement. Right now, most of the problems of the world seem to be centered on the inability of people, whether they are presidents, whether they are family members, whether they are identity groups. We don't seem to agree on anything. And yet, by focusing purely on agreement, we are missing out on so much. When I look at not just social media, when I look at New York Times, when I look at The Guardian, when I look at all the newspapers and shows that I watch, everything is centered on very clear stances that are begging for agreement. Disagreement is seen as not just uncomfortable, which is completely understandable, but disagreement is also seen as you are offending who I am. Your disagreement shows that you don't respect me. Because if you did, you would agree with the way I look at the world. Rukmini says, perhaps the capacity we need to build most in the world today is the ability to gracefully disagree as we may coexist. This reminds me of one line of a song from when I was in college, my little group. One of our favorite musicians was a Texan guy called Sean Phillips. That's Shawn. And in one of his songs, I'll try to find it and mail it out, the YouTube video, if I can find it. He says, the art is gone of kind exception. This is what Rukmini is talking about, graceful disagreement. Historically, the difference between a barbarian and a civilized person has been the ability to disagree gracefully. because a barbarian is like a 3-year old with a tantrum, very clear about what it wants and determined to get it and determined to do whatever necessary to get what they want. All disagreement is an insult and is a threat. It's not just that the disagreement has to be removed, the person who disagrees has to be destroyed. That's barbaric. Civilization, with its protocols, with its norms, with its very often stilted ways of talking. You see, when we look at the Victorians or the courts of the French kings or the English monarchs, we mock them for their extremely stilted ways in which they communicate, the very formal ways in which they engage with each other. We are casual people. We are informal people. We are hail fellow, well met. Hey, how are you? I can take off my shoes and put my feet up on the couch when I'm talking to you. And I want to leave you all with this thought. This is true even in, for instance, the Chinese courts, the Indian, the Mughals. The highest example of human civilization always set out very clear norms, not just laws, norms for social conduct. And the reason was to minimize conflict. Because if I have to go through 4 motions, bend in a certain way, bring my hands in a certain way, wear certain clothes, say 5 things before I get to the point, I am reducing the possibility of impetuous reactivity. Can you imagine what our social media would look like if it were conducted by Mughal courtiers, by the Victorians? You and I might not be very happy because it would look stilted and artificial. But I can assure you, they would have gotten to their point. And diplomacy, the art of diplomacy, which we didn't see in the White House with the Zelensky meeting, the art of diplomacy is the art of very clear, formalized ways of engaging with the other in order to eventually get to the point, eventually get to the compromises necessary and the agreement that would allow for life to continue. Thank you. Thank you so much. You're all people I know. And thank you for coming, because your coming here today has been an enormous support for me, because I'm doing this for the first time. And I've already told you my reservations, my hesitations about speaking to a camera. But just the fact that I know you're there and you're commenting, it has given me the confidence and created comfort in my engaging with you here. Thank you so much. I would really appreciate it if you can make this a Sunday habit. And I would also appreciate it if you can actually tell your friends and peers it's free. I don't intend to charge for these at all. And I'm hoping that we can at least take 45 minutes, the beginning of the week, Sunday, to clear our air, to think about the normal anxieties of life, whether it's personal or public. And we can start the week with a slightly fresh and what I call a reason-based perspective. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend and week, and I'll see you next Sunday. Thank you.